Podium Audio presents.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to TBRCon 2025's first panel of the day, publishing in more than one genre. Joining me today are a bunch of awesome authors, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a moment. But first, for those joining us live, thank you. And feel free to add questions or comments in the live comments, and we will be bringing them up on the screen as we go or towards the end, as we please. So starting from Anna Stevens, tell us a little bit about yourself and the types of books you write and all of that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Stevens. I am the author of the Godblind and the Songs of the Drowned trilogies, which are both epic fantasy that slides more towards the gritty, possibly even grimdark end of the scale. I also write IP work for Black Library, for Age of Sigmar and Warhammer Horror. And I also wrote 2 prose novels for Marvel Comics, so superhero fiction, which was super interesting and very cool. And that is me.
Hi, I'm Django Wexler. My most recent fantasy book is How to Become the Dark Lord and Die Trying, and a book from Podium Audio actually called Last Stop, which both came out last year. But for the purposes of this panel, I've written young adult fiction in the Wells of Sorcery trilogy. I've written middle grade fiction in the Forbidden Library series, and I've written some IP stuff. I did some Magic the Gathering set fiction, and just recently did Memory's Wake, which is a Spelljammer novel for D&D. So that's my genre spread. Have we lost her? That looked frozen for a sec.
Are we going to me?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't know if we were going clockwise. Hi, I'm Quenby Olson. I am the author of the Miss Percy Guide trilogy, which is a cozy fantasy trilogy. I've also written the Half-Killed series, which is more Victorian mystery with some touches of horror. And I've also written historical romances, which range from non-spicy to spicy. So there's a whole stretch of things across the board there. And those are my books.
Hi, I'm Miles Cameron. I've published 50 books in a variety of genres. Red Knight in fantasy, Artifact Space is my latest in science fiction. I also write a lot of historical fiction, ancient Greece, the American Revolution, and the 14th century Italy, 15th century Italy. I like all of history.
Wonderful, thank you. So I believe we can jump into our very first question. And we are going to start from Miles, because I know you have lots of thoughts on this. And this is your moment to shine. So using a pen name for separating between your genres, when is it a good idea, and when might it be unnecessary or cumbersome?
Well, I'm going to leap right in with the unnecessary and cumbersome side. I believe that I am so old that when I started writing in multiple genres, my historical fiction editor thought that historical fiction was somehow a better or more literary kind of fiction, and so I should hide myself and have a different name for fantasy and sci-fi, which I would have, at the time, I thought it wasn't the greatest idea. As it has turned out, I think it interrupts in as much as all of us creatives do most of our own advertising, it makes social media much more complicated because at Glasgow this year at Worldcon, I had someone recommend my own books to me and say, you should read Christian Cameron. His historical fiction is really like your fantasy fiction. And that, I mean, it's funny, but and a little embarrassing. What? Sorry,
is he your brother? Are you related?
We're the same person. Yeah. Anyway,
I know. I'm doing a bit.
I actually, my ongoing joke, Django, is that he's my cousin, but apparently I've said that so often jokingly that it's been passed on to the community as the reality. So I'm like, no, not my cousin. It's actually me. Anyway, so Eleni, I don't want to go on too long, but I would say in the long run, it's probably better to keep the same name because, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this later, there's a lot of carryover between horror and fantasy, sci-fi, and even historical. A lot of the same people are reading the same stuff. When I make recommendations to my readers for you all, I recommend across genre, and I get a lot of positive comments back. So I'm kind of in favor of one name for the whole thing.
Figured that might be the case. What about you, Quan? Oh, sorry. Quen, did you hear me?
Yeah, I would say for me, a lot of the different genres that I write in, they overlap enough because they're all historical. So the only thing where I see people complain is when they say, oh, well, some of the romances that you write are clean and some of them are spicy. And some people are very adamant that I don't want this. I don't want to read spicy and I don't want to read clean. I want all the spice. So the only time that I will see people complain about me marketing all of my books on one social media track is the romance. That's the only time that I see people say, oh, you should have these under a different name because, you know, the non-spicy and the spicy, some people don't want to read that. And I'm thinking, I make it very clear in the blurb. I make it very clear in the cover. The covers of the spicy books have couples in a very, you know, spicy kind of more that you would expect, and the non-spicy romances look
the bodice rippers.
Jane Austen. Yes, thank you. The bodices look like they're about to be ripped. So that's the only time I see people say, oh, maybe you should have a different name or you should be marketing these on different channels. Everything else, though, from Miss Percy, which is all cute dragons, to the Half-Killed, which is, you know, darker and dead bodies and things, there seems to be no problem with people jumping and saying, I read this, so I went over and read this, and I thought it was also great. So I've never had a problem with that, except for when sex comes into the question. That's it.
Quen, maybe you could put the letter S between Quenby S. Olson, just as
So
Quenby Spice Olson.
Yeah, Quenby Spice Olson and maybe Quenby C, Quenby Chased Olson.
Django, we interrupted you before.
That's fine. I wasn't sure if you were calling on us or if we were just jumping in. I basically agree with Miles and Christian. I think the idea of different pen names for different genres is kind of a thing of the past these days, because as authors, we are so much more responsible for our own branding than we were, 20 years ago or 40 years ago. It feels like an artifact of the kind of pre-internet age, when the author's brand was much more in the hands of a publisher if you were in trad, and at the time trad was the only game in town. And they might be like, oh, well, okay, we want to establish a slightly different persona for you. But these days, like, unless you have the bandwidth to run 2 completely parallel social media tracks, and who does, your name is your brand as an author, and there's no point in having separate identities. The only a couple of cases, like sometimes if you're if you're doing really spicy work and also like children's fiction, there might be an argument for it. You know, I've done children's fiction and never anything like super spicy, but you know, normal levels of spicy, and that has never really been a problem. It can also, I like what James Corey did, that is Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham. If you are like a team, using a single pseudonym for all of you makes sense, because everyone's used to a single author for a book. The whole like system is set up for that, so that does seem to be a good way. But yeah, overall I would say these days, you know, especially if you're just starting out now, like definitely don't bother.
What about you, Anna?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the others. My name is actually something of a pseudonym, because it's Stevens is my maiden name, and the reason for that is because Harper Voyager signed me, who my married name is Anna Smith, 1 month after they had signed Anna Smith Spark, and we were due to be published 1 month apart, and it was just two Anna Smiths being published by the same publisher, both in grimdark, a month apart, both with dark hair. It was just, there was just too many correlations. So they said, would you be willing to change your name? And so I just said, well, easiest thing is to just use my maiden name, which is fine. I mean, I was actually, I guess I would say I was slightly disappointed because, you know, I'd only been married a couple of years and, you know, wanted to use my married name. But we agreed that on the copyright page, it says Anna Smith instead of Anna Stevens. So just, you know, just so that it's still in there to say, you know, who I am. But I think that would be like the only time I think I would have done something like that. I certainly didn't do anything for my IP work or because I think, you know, it's about growing an audience and increasing your visibility and your brand. And if you're doing that across multiple genres, you want people to come from Warhammer and think, well, what else has this person written? Or you want people to, you know, pick up a Marvel novel for their teenagers and then think, you know, well, does Anna write anything else that's for an older audience kind of thing? So yeah, I think if you can harmonize it as much as possible, then apart from if Django said, you know, kink versus kids fiction, you probably want to separate those out a little bit. But otherwise, I think own your whole body of work and be open about it.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense, and I tend to agree with all of you, and that's what I've seen the most while researching the whole deal a bit more. And I found myself, incidentally, I used some past podcasts, even from Christian, because I did an MRes in science fiction and fantasy, and I was comparing like the use of pen names and how different genres are marketed and how they need to be sold to audiences and to publishers alike. So on that topic, in our current social media centric landscape, a lot of the marketing, like you all said in a way, is self-promotion now. So have you found that different approaches are needed for each of your genres, or do you go about it more or less the same way for your works? And we can start from Quenby.
I find that, yeah, there is definitely a different approach, especially between the cozy fantasy or even just fantasy in general and the romance. Even though romantasy is a huge thing right now, those two separate, the cozy fantasy and then the historical romance, I have to approach them completely differently. The cozy fantasy is very much, you know, oh, do you love Jane Austen, and do you love tea parties, and do you love cute fuzzy things? And I feel like I'm kind of attracting this very, you know, people who would also maybe read Agatha Christie and Jane Austen in this kind of quaint British feel. Whereas with the historical romance, it's very much pushing, the Quenby Olson, do you like sex? Do you like men with bare chests? Do you, which, I mean, it sounds like I'm peddling this, but it's a very different way of going about pushing it, which it does make it interesting when you're trying to promote both on the same social media feed, where it's like, here's a cute little tea party, and then here's the bodice ripper and the sex scene excerpt and things like that, and trying to find a balance and not offend anyone, and just kind of make them realize this is two sides of the same author coin here that I have to deal with.
Miles or anyone who wants to chime in. I don't need to give you an order. You go ahead as you like.
I'll say for me, the biggest difference has always been between the kids' books and the adult stuff. It's not even a different sort of like approach, as in like a type of promotion, but just completely different channels. The kids find their books in completely different ways, which is tricky because, you know, I've always been used to the adult stuff, and all I really have control of is my basic social media. So that's where you get a lot of help in trad from the publishers for, like, especially for middle grade. It's hard to reach those, like, you know, the middle grade kids are not on Blue Sky reading excerpts of my novels. And so you do school visits and you do cons and stuff like that is a much better way to reach those people. That, you know, some used to be you could do TikTok, now maybe that's not anymore. I don't know. It's a little difficult because it changes so much. That's been the problem for me. The adult stuff has stayed relatively static in its kind of like basic idea, but the, you know, what kids are into changes all the time, and it always makes me feel super, super old. So that's definitely the harder side when it comes to different genres.
Can I go, Anna? Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, so one thing I have noticed, because my two main areas are fantasy and historicals, is that the speculative fiction community is way more of a community with an infrastructure to it, like cons. And because it's very inclusive, I don't just mean inclusive in terms of race and gender, but it is more inclusive, I think, than historical. It's also inclusive across subgenres, so that Comic-Con is completely open to fantasy and gothic horror and whatever. And the result, sorry, that was a long-winded intro, but what I mean is, once you sort of get into the slot in speculative fiction of knowing who to talk to in social media and how to present yourself in social media, you get very quickly, I feel, to a pretty wide audience, or at least that audience is available. Historical fiction, I find, supposedly it has a broader appeal, but it doesn't have that community and that infrastructure. So it is much more dependent on, like, sort of daily posting and so on. And honestly, if I weren't a reenactor who could put up reasonably cool pictures of armor and people doing stuff and riding horses, I'm not sure anybody would notice that my historical fiction existed, because it's a lot harder to get the word out in historical, I feel, than it is in any form of speculative fiction. And that is weird. It's just different. And again, I'll just say one more time, it's about the amount of infrastructure in speculative fiction. So, and I want to back what Django says, like, across the genres, it's young people tend, I think, to change. Just, I don't want to repeat what Django said, but like, and you feel old. Imagine how old I feel. I'm considerably older. The way they're taking in social media changes so quickly. Even without canceling TikTok, the thing that is fashionable or the thing that's being used by the group you're targeting changes, so that it's like, oh, good, I get to find a new social media platform and then try and represent myself as an old gray-haired person to 19-year-olds who hopefully are interested in ancient Greece.
Like,
it's a harder road to hoe.
I'm old enough to remember when Facebook was the hot new thing for kids. And
yeah. And just to help everybody out, my daughter and all of her fashionable 21-year-old friends barely consume social media. They view social media as like, that's so passé. People should talk to each other face to face, which is hilariously like talking to my mother. Anyway.
That gives me hope for the future.
But do you also think...
I was going to chime in and say my 13-year-old and my 15-year-old daughters also, they are rarely on social media. They would rather just sit and watch, K-dramas on Netflix. They're not doing TikTok. They're not doing Instagram. So it's interesting, making me wonder if the very fast shift of social media is almost alienating them as well, that it's just, they don't want to anymore. My 15-year-old will sit and play the ukulele. She's not sitting there scrolling TikTok and things like that.
I think that was one of the main things that for me it started making me feel old, and I'm barely 27, but not true, 27 and a half. But it was also like the change around of Instagram, because that was my first social media platform that I joined, that I started using actively. And the way that it's changed, even in the last 5 years, it's making me feel like a crotchety person that does not want to learn new tech. Which is pretty amusing. So I totally understand all of your daughters and all the children, because we do not want to keep up with it in that way. But what I tried to say before, do you think, Christian, it's because the main difference between the historical fiction community and the SFF community, is it maybe also because of I'm generalizing here very widely, but the age groups that read those subgenres? Mostly because
I'm going to say yes and no. A lot of historical fiction readers are as broad a category as SFF readers. I notice that when we get together, when authors get together, we often talk about young people. But when you go to a con and look around, you realize a lot of readers are in their 40s or 50s or 60s. There are people at Worldcon who have been reading fantasy since there was nothing on the shelf but Andre Norton and J.R.R. Tolkien. So we're all dealing with a broad band of people. And I think we make a mistake when we think, oh, it's younger readers, younger readers, younger readers. Certainly, the data is a little soul destroying as you see that something like 10% of UK 12-year-olds describe reading as pleasurable. And when I think of what I was doing at age 12, and I'm a very nerdy guy, but I was like consuming anything I could read from Jane Austen to J.R.R. Tolkien when I was 12. It is a little soul destroying to imagine that the 12-year-olds have given up on reading. And not really an answer to your question, Eleni, but I just want to say to Quenby, so over Christmas, my daughter's home from university, and she looks at her parents and says, you guys brought your phones to the dinner table? And my wife's an executive, like we're both, and she's like, what kind of people are you? Don't just put them away. And this is the 21-year-old telling the 62-year-olds to put their phones away. It was very embarrassing.
Oh, how the tables turn. Anna, we interrupted you.
No, that's fine. I was just going to add in that I think I found one of the easiest books to hand sell at a convention was the Marvel novels. And we went to my publisher had a table at a stand at UK Games Expo over sort of 4 days, and it was just, tens of thousands of people were passing through that expo every single day, and there were an awful lot of kids and teenagers there, and obviously you got the big Marvel banner and stuff like that, which immediately attracts attention, and those books were just the easiest to sell to teenagers. They both feature Lady Sif and Brunhild the Valkyrie as like a double act fighting evil. And I was a little bit hesitant as to who among these teenagers, because there was a lot more teenage boys than girls at this Games Expo. And literally the gender split in people who bought the books was probably 50-50. Like everybody was just, it was really easy because I'd just say, do you like Marvel films? Yes. Do you think there should be more girls in the Marvel films? Yes. Read this book. And they'd all go, Mom, can I have some money? And it was incredible. I've never been able to sell books that easily in my life. I think that for me, working in Black Library in the Warhammer space, I have to treat that one differently because it is a very intense fandom, shall we say. And people do, they will take offense at the slightest thing. If you don't know the lore, if you're not up to date on the latest versions of the books and all that kind of stuff, it feels a little bit like the YA community that I've heard about and will never dip my toe into for as long as I'm a writer, because it scares the life out of me. But the Warhammer community does seem to have that same kind of cliquey, intense feel to it. So my approach to that one has just been, look, there's a book out. And then just hide and let other people say whether or not they liked it, and just leave it at that. Because I know a few authors who have been pretty much torn to shreds by the Warhammer community online, which, I'm not, oh God, there's probably Warhammer people watching this. I appreciate you. I love you. It's all good. It's just, people get very, very passionate about that IP, which is absolutely their prerogative.
Sorry, at the opposite end of the spectrum, and I sort of answering Anna, the other problem with historical fiction that blows my mind, because I think of all of history as interesting, is that historical fiction people compartment themselves in a way that really boggles to me. Like they'll go like, oh, I only read Roman fiction. I only read Tudor fiction. And I'm like, what? And sometimes it's super nationalist. I know Americans who are only interested in American history, and a lot of English. I love the English, but there's a like, is the main character English? Because otherwise I don't read it. Oh, okay, you realize the rest of the world had exciting history, right? Like, anyway, but it is, again, hard to advertise to because people pigeonhole themselves in a way that, again, I don't find with speculative fiction readers, who I find are like, oh yeah, sure, I'll try some horror. I'll try a book by an Indian author set in a fantasy Indian Mughal past. Sure, that, like, what are there swords? Great, I'll like it, or whatever. And that really makes it easier to communicate to potential readers because they'll kind of try anything.
Definitely.
I was going to say something. I was at an event once and we had a table and it was me and two other authors, and it was all fantasy books, a mix of fantasy and romantasy. And we had several different people come up and they'd say, well, I only read Civil War history, like US Civil War. And I'm like, we have banners here with swords and, these bright colors and things like that. No, we don't have any US Civil War. Oh, well, I only read, Revolutionary War and things. I'm like, we don't have that. We only, and it was, like you said, it was very, the compartmentalized, where it was just, it's only Civil War. It's only Revolutionary War. I'm here in Pennsylvania where the US Civil War is a really huge deal. And it was fascinating to see that it was only historical readers who would come up and say, I only read this thing. Do you have any of that? No, we have swords and fantasy and wolves and things like that, but we don't have any Civil War. And then they would just turn and walk away. Like, that's it.
Fantasy fans can have their tics. It's just not quite as widespread. As someone who's, my first fantasy book is a Napoleonic thing, so muskets and cavalry and cannons, And there were definitely some people who were like, well, it's not fantasy if it has guns in it. It doesn't count. So
wait till they found out about gunpowder fantasy.
Yeah, well, we coined that term. Me and Brian McClellan came out with these gunpowder flintlock fantasy books and
they're both so good.
Like a month or two apart from each other.
Yeah, they're amazing. I'm a very big fan of both because gunpowder fantasy is one of my personal favorites. So it was great to have them. And fun fact, I actually found the 1,000 Names for the first time many years ago in a tiny bookstore in Barcelona. They had like a teeny tiny English section with the usual 5 classics and then the 1,000 Names.
Huh.
And dear seasoned fantasy writer that I am, I was like, what's that?
That's
and then Napoleonic Wars. Yeah, it was great. So we touched on this a little bit already, and we will go back to the whole working for an AP in a moment. But does publishing in more than one genre or even more than one medium give you a more rounded idea of what the landscape is like, of the publishing landscape is like? And we can start from Anna or whoever wants to go first.
So I think my experience has probably been a little bit more limited than someone else on the panel because so I write epic fantasy, and then the Age of Sigmar stuff for Black Library is basically fantasy. So my only sort of foray was my Warhammer horror novel, which they wanted to be very obviously set in the Warhammer universe, but they wanted sort of a gothic horror edge to it, which was really, really great because they basically said, think of, the Hound of the Baskervilles, think of, Dracula, hauntings, these kinds of ideas. So that was really fun just to play around with. And then I suppose superhero novels is quite a fairly niche one, because I wouldn't normally be, like saying that my characters can lift up a truck and throw it at somebody. So it's very interesting to play around with different rules and conventions. I'm not entirely sure it broadened my knowledge of the publishing landscape per se, because they do all fit loosely or more closely under fantasy. So I think I should throw this one over to the others.
I think for me, it helped drive home that I don't understand the publishing landscape as a whole. It's very easy if you read a lot to feel like, you do. I read both fantasy and science fiction, and I hang out on Reddit a lot. Therefore, I understand what publishing is all about. And just sort of dipping your toe into any other section, the rules are so different and the landscape is so different that you then, if you can look out at all the different categories there are and you're like, this is complicated. Like, there really isn't a good way to be like, I know the whole publishing landscape, even in a relatively restricted set of genres. So I don't know that it helped me understand, but it certainly helped me, acquire humility, I guess is what I'd say. And not pretend that I understand anything outside of my little niche.
Fair enough. Quen?
Okay. I think for me, writing in romance, which is one of the huge genres in publishing, it gave me a very clear idea of how much it makes and how much it dominates the industry, which is, I think, why romantasy is doing so huge now, because then it brings in, anyone who grew up watching Disney movies or loving Lord of the Rings, but thinking, what, let's just throw some romance in there and really kind of explore that aspect of it. It's just huge. And it's made me appreciate when I see bookstores sometimes would push away, oh, we don't sell romance. Romance is this genre we don't carry. It's over in the corner. And then I think when it started to boom so large, and then all of a sudden now we're having romance signings, we're having Valentine's Day signings, we're bringing in these romance authors because they realize how huge a part of the industry it is and how much money is there. So as a fantasy author, I think on the same vein, I feel humbled sometimes that I'll think, oh, if I'm doing okay here in my little fantasy corner, and then I see these romance authors that are just like, boom, 6 figures indie. They're going nuts over there. So it really, my following both groups there with fantasy and romance, I can see just how huge the romance part of the publishing industry is, and how how strict the rules are there with you have to have a happy ending and all of those different things. But it really does let me see that fantasy is just this one part of it, and then you have all of romantasy, which then leads into all of the mystery and the cozy mysteries. I think it really opens my eyes to see that we're just in this one small corner of it. Even if we're writing multiple subgenres, there's just so much more there, and it's so daunting.
Yeah, I get little tastes of that because my wife writes romantasy, among other things, and so talking with her about what that genre is like it's eye-opening if you've never seen it before, if that's not been your niche.
Especially the Russian doll-ness of that whole area now, also with the book talk and Bookstagaram, all of those going by tropes to break everything down. That is just one big branching out into forever. So
my first genre was thrillers, and I wrote thrillers with my dad. I think we wrote 8 of them back in the days of Tom Clancy. And so when I came to historical fiction, and it's a little like what you're saying about romance, the amounts of money were enormously different. The instant readership was enormously different. And another glimpse of the publishing world that I get is my wife is a magazine executive. And magazines, unlike the publishing industry, and I hope nobody from Hachette is listening, they do things like focus groups, and they actually pay attention to what their readers are looking for. And they do an enormous amount of market research before they release their Christmas issue or whatever. And my spouse is quite blunt about her views of the publishing industry's fire and forget methods of trying to, you're a new fantasy author and they will basically fire your fantasy novel off with very little support in a very different way than the magazine industry would have supported it. So I often look with a jaundiced eye, and I will say that one of the things that I see as a multiple genre writer, and I want to be careful about saying this because I actually love my publisher, but I have a new book coming out. I won't go into detail about it, but I think my publishers have big hopes for it. So I was sent the marketing plan, and my wife laughed aloud and said, "Wow, a marketing plan, that's amazing. Why don't you demand they provide those for all your speculative fiction books?" Because it's a detailed marketing plan across several different media sources. And it suggests that, people in advertising are actually going to work at advertising a book. Whereas, to be blunt, my feeling about many of my speculative fiction books is it's kind of my job. If I don't advertise them, no one will. And much less a detailed marketing plan provided 4 months in advance. Like, I appeal to you speculative fiction authors. Is this your day-to-day life? Or maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm just a perennial mid-list author who gets left at the starting post. I think that different parts of the publishing industry have different, I almost want to describe them as life ways. They have different ideas of who their audiences are and different approaches. And I think some of those are quite antiquated. I think that the publishing industry is not always as great as it thinks it is at getting your work out even to core audiences. And I'll use an example, and I hope it's not a contentious example, but a few years ago, I was asked to basically represent myself better on TikTok. And I said, do you have any marketing numbers to show that readers of my, this was about historical fiction, readers of my historical fiction use TikTok or pay attention to TikTok influencers? And they didn't have any evidence. They just sort of talked about it at the coffee room and decided that TikTok was the new thing. And that's not real marketing research and not really necessarily the way to move forward. Anyway, I could do a whole panel on this bit, but I'm going to go with Django's humble. Knowing multiple genres has only made me feel like I know less and I'm not particularly important.
It's definitely not just you, by the way. It's the curse of the mid-list author that, amounts of money that seem, significant to us in terms of, how much is at stake with these novels, it's a year of my income or whatever, are so trivial by the standards of these corporate behemoths that they devote almost no effort to selling these books. The individual people involved are usually great. My editors and all the publicists and all those people, I love them. But, there are not enough of them.
I'm totally with you, Django. It's just that there are a lot of details to know, and I'm not sure this is even true across all publishers. But do you know that most editors have a pot of money, and that's how much money they can spend on the various books they purchase over a particular year, and it's like a budget quarterly thing. So that, what I'm about to say maybe is a trade secret, or maybe I'm dead wrong, but it seems to me to be much easier to sell a contract in late October, early November, because they know how much money they have left over. And if you've got a new book idea, it might be a good time, as opposed to in April, where they're trying to line up their big name $150,000 huge front list contracts, and they don't know how much money is going to be in the pot for the year. It seems that way to me.
But you don't want something brilliant to come in when you've already spent all your money. So you've got to hold something back for later in the year. Whereas when you get towards the end of the year, you got to spend it, or corporate will take it back. We should stop dominating this, though. I feel like we've gotten off topic here. I also could talk about publishing spoils first.
I think. Wait. Hello.
Sorry, I have it down for starting at 6 p.m. and am I super late?
A little bit.
Sorry, I didn't double check the time an hour ago.
Don't worry. So
I was all like, oh, look, I'm 15 minutes ahead of time. I'm good to go. So my apologies, guys.
it's okay. We still have plenty of time. So introduce yourself. Tell us who you are and of the types of genres you write in.
Hi, I'm L.R. Lamb, and I'm the writer of science fiction and fantasy novels. I've got 9 out so far with a 10th on the way, and I've kind of run the gamut of different subgenres. I've done gaslight fantasy, space opera, near future thrillers, epic fantasy, cyberpunk. I think that's it for now.
Thank you. So we were just wrapping up and answering, does publishing in more than one genre or medium give you a more rounded idea of what the publishing landscape is like? So if you want to get started with that for you.
Sorry, could you repeat that? It froze.
Does publishing in more than one genre or medium give you a more rounded idea of what the publishing landscape is like? And the general consensus so far has been that it humbles you.
I think so, yeah. Like, I feel like I've learned skills from publishing in different genres that can kind of, transfer back to the other ones in certain ways, and other things that you think would work doesn't transfer over. But I really like learning about all the different areas of the industry and ways to market, because for example, Goldilocks in the background there, that one was IP, and I know one of the questions was about IP, but it wasn't an established franchise or anything. It was where the publisher came up with the idea, and I developed it and was given a lot of flexibility. So I really enjoyed that different way into the publishing landscape as well, because I felt like I was sending it along the way, and it was a lot more collaborative up front. And I found that's leveled up my skills in writing, I think, since then. So it was really valuable.
Great, thank you. And we will get to the IP question later. Actually, we haven't touched on that yet. A tiny bit, but
when did the panel start? How late am I? I am 45 minutes late. Okay. Oh, well, it's better late than never. Sorry.
We still have 40 minutes, so you're fine.
Yeah.
And yes, definitely better late than never. So, do you all find that writing in different genres helps you use different aspects of your background, your life experiences as inspiration? And we can start from Christian because, well, you're the reenactor. So also, I'm a little disappointed you didn't show up in armor this time, I have to admit.
You didn't ask.
Yeah, but...
I can't be in armor for every TBRCon, especially when I'm 1,000 miles from my home. And you know what? It takes me another human being to get me into the armor, which I'm going to use as a clever segue to say, sure, I think life experience is a great deal of... It's a great deal of the way I write, but every writer has a different system. I usually sit in a coffee shop to write, so I sit with 2 or 3 other writers from different genres. One woman writes for video games, one woman is screenwriting, and we're all there every day. I think of writing as an immersive thing where I'm trying to immerse the reader in an experience. So I am a method writer, and I want to have done all the things and eaten the food and danced the dances. But that's not how everybody writes, and I can't speak for other authors. So yeah, it's important to me. I guess I'm sort of speaking to Quenby, but I haven't read a lot of cozy fantasy, but I've discovered some fabulous cozy actual history, which is 19th century diplomatic journals, which are almost entirely about going to amazing embassy parties and then writing home to your mother about them. It's just the most, anyway, and I'm doing this deep dive because I am writing some Gaslight fantasy at the moment, and I really wanted to understand 2 things. One, worker unrest in Victorian Europe, but then at the other end, like sort of the upstairs, downstairs world, and reading the journals of sort of great ladies has been super helpful in understanding, in a way, how hard they worked. Like, I'm very interested in women's lives in the late 19th century, and being one of those quote unquote great ladies was a full-time job, and understanding that makes for better writing, like for better describing what a day is like and what an embassy function is like and what a sleigh ride in Russia is like. I'll make it into fantasy, but I really want to understand how all of it works. So yeah, anyway, immersion, that's my thing, but it's not necessarily everybody's thing.
That sounds like my thing as well. I need those. I kind of want to read those journals now. I'm curious.
Yeah, that reminds me of when my first book came out, and I was talking to some friends of my husband, and they were saying, well, you know, how can you write male characters? You're not a man. You don't know what it's like to be kicked in the testicles. And I was like, no, you're absolutely right. I don't know what it's like to be kicked in the testicles. I know what it's like to break a couple of toes. And I can also ask people questions and say, well, is it a sharp pain? Is it a burning pain? Is it a dull pain? Is it, does it make you want to vomit? Sorry?
How often does that come up? That seems like...
It was a very random ad hoc. I don't know whether he was just a little bit flummoxed by the whole suggestion that I had written a novel. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that bringing some sort of life experience is really important, just for that feeling of authenticity. But obviously we can't do all the things, and especially if we're writing about magic or space flight, or, you know, we can't do those things. So it is that marriage between experience, research, and imagination. And I think at some point you just have to trust your reader to not quibble too much. It might not be exactly what their experience is, but then nothing ever is. Everyone experiences the world in their own way, and no two people see things in exactly the same way. So that extends to reading novels as well. But yeah, I mean, I do like to bring as much experience as possible, and where experience fails, I read an awful lot of books.
Yeah, I very much agree with Anna there that experience can be important, but it is sometimes overrated. This idea that you shouldn't write about things unless you have personal experience is, it's sometimes true and it's sometimes not. It depends in some sense on how many other people have personal experience. I wouldn't try to write a novel about, I don't know, growing up black in Harlem in the 1980s, at least not without a heck of a lot of research, and probably not even then, because there are so many people who actually really had that experience, and I'm not one of them by any stretch of the imagination. But I can write about, the experience of going to war in the Napoleonic era, because everyone who had that experience is dead. So I have the same access to it that anyone has, which is I can read the books and the letters and the memoirs by the people who did. And that's all we've got. And so it really kind of depends on where you're at in terms of things. And that's, one reason I tend towards the sort of fantasy and fantastical and historically based stuff is because it does serve as kind of an equalizer. The stuff that I do in my regular life can be a little boring. I'm a pretty white bread boring guy. But I can write about medieval knights as well as, well, not as well as Miles, but as well as most people.
Quinn?
I agree so far also with everyone else. You can only take so much of your own experiences to a certain extent, because if I was only writing about my own experiences, all my characters would be ballet dancers and have like 10,000 children. So, that's it. That's all my books. So it goes the same with crime writers. We don't expect them all to be murderers or something like that, so that, well, gee, what is your experience? How many people have you killed? Do you know how that is? I mean, but they have to research. I always think of in the extras of Lord of the Rings, when there was the scene where Peter Jackson was telling Christopher Lee like how to react when Wormtongue stabbed him, and he was telling him, you should scream. And Christopher Lee is like, oh, no, that's not what happens when you stab someone in the lungs. And everyone's like, oh, that's an experience. But we have to find out. We have to learn. We have to research. I'm writing about raising dragons. I'm writing about seances in 19th century London. I'm writing about all these different things. I don't know these things. I have to research them. I have to go by the records of other people's experiences and read about spiritualists from that time period. And I have to read about, well, I can't read about dragons but I can, take what other people have written and kind of make an amalgam for my own fantasy. So really, as with any genre, it's research, and then combining that with, I think, who you are as a person and your experiences.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I have not been a dragon either, but you can think about empathy, right? You can imagine, like, how would a dragon describe things if they had language? How would they describe, like, measures of distance, like a wingspan, instead of foot or something like that? And then that helps with the immersion and the believability. And then on the other hand, like, obviously most of us are not astronauts, but astronauts do exist, right? So for my near future thriller stuff, I'll read loads of astronaut memoirs and try and imagine what it's like. I'll watch a lot of the NASA live streams. I was lucky enough to be able to do a private tour of the Johnson Space Center earlier this month, which was one of the coolest experiences of my life. I got to walk into mission control. I got to ask a flight director targeted questions about my book for half an hour. I have a contact, any writers who want that, you can email me and I can see if that can get set up. And so, you know, I have no science background. I will never go to space, but I think between all the research and imagining, I can believably write about going to space. And then the joy of it is that the reader also gets to be transported to space.
That sounds like the coolest thing ever.
It was so cool. It was. I was just like this. I was like a kid in the candy store. There's like a whole recreation of the ISS, like a 1-to-1 scale, and I got to go into the like JAXA module, and so there's like a picture of me going like this. I got to go to the neutral buoyancy lab. It was really cool.
Do they expect you to produce an actual book? Can I do it? And then they're
I
like,
did
wait a
have to
minute, your
tell
books were
them.
about
I did have to
fantasy.
tell them like I'm actually writing this book. It has a contract.
Dang it.
So I did have to do that, but they were really happy. I went through those celebrity engagement strands, so I was the celebrity, which felt really fun.
One word that I haven't heard anybody mention, so I'll just toss it in, is also extrapolation. Like, you have life experiences, and so I also have never met a dragon, but I have met a charging rhino. And no, I'm not kidding. The rhino vastly influenced how I wrote griffins and dragons in Red Knight, because having experienced really large angry animals in Africa, I'm not saying that I did anything bold or daring at the time, but I mostly went, wow, just standing your ground here would be an amazing act of courage, because these things are really big. So just imagine if they had wings and could fly. Extrapolation is very helpful, and I was just listening to another fantasy writer, a friend of mine, in a private conversation talking about horseback riding and how much he'd gotten out of just modern horseback riding in terms of like an experience that he could then extrapolate into a book. And I think extrapolation is something that all of us do well. We sort of take this and put it there.
Yeah, my friend Hazel McBride, her dragons are basically based on whales because she used to work with orcas and stuff like that. So she just made them dragons.
That is so cool.
I feel like many dragons are just giant cats, which is possibly less
Toothless.
realistic.
Robin Hobbs said
that would be my dragons. My dragons are giant cats. So I will say with the extrapolation, I took my butthead cat from when I was a kid and was like, what would my butthead cat do in this situation? Oh, it would fall on its back. And then, so yeah, there's the experience of just taking that and going, okay, here's my butthead cat with wings, setting things on fire and not catching mice properly and just, climbing up the curtains. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Robin Hobb described her dragons as like cats meets angry geese, which I thought fit well.
Have it been on the receiving end of an angry goose? Oof.
They're scary.
Yeah, they have teeth, very, very sharp teeth. So, before we devolve into more cat shenanigans, which, let's be honest, we'll have the time for, let's go back to the IP question that we sort of teased earlier. So, for those of you who have written or published for an established IP or a big IP, what was that process like with the limitations, the freedom that it entails? Were you offered the job? Did you apply for the job? How did that all go about? And we can start even from Anna. You were saying the differences.
Yeah, sure. So for the Black Library stuff, they initially contacted me and asked me to write a couple of short stories. And I think it's a bit of a sounding board process. So I did a few short stories for them, and then they asked me to do a novella. And then, like, when I proved that I could handle a novella length, that's when they asked me to do the novel. So it was definitely a really, really interesting process. Sort of learning the world and the lore and the rules, but then also learning the limitations. You absolutely cannot write this. You absolutely cannot write that. You cannot have any swearing whatsoever in like modern day swearing. You can have Warhammer swearing, but you can't have any kind of expletives whatsoever. But you can have as much graphic violence as you like, which I always found to be quite a strange dichotomy between the two, because you're not going to be saying oh gosh when someone's just hacked your leg off, but you have to. So that was a very interesting experience. The Warhammer horror novel that I did was a really collaborative experience between me and my Black Library editor, she got in touch with me and she said, we want to write this, we want to produce this horror novel, we want it to have a really gothic feel. We already have the names and archetypes of the main characters. So we've got the sharpshooter, we've got the witch, we've got the sorcerer, we've got the priest, blah blah blah. And we want to know whether you would be interested in writing it. And it felt, at first, it felt even more restrictive than my previous IP stuff, because they were dictating names and who these characters were and what and the ultimate outcome of the story. But I was intrigued enough by the story that they wanted me to tell, so that I agreed to do it. And I found it a very rewarding, but quite an odd experience. It also taught me that actually I can be an incredibly lazy writer. So if someone wants to just give me a story and be like, just go away and write this, you don't need to think about the world building. You don't need to think about the characters. Just write the story. I'm like, oh, okay. So it was strange having someone else had done all of that work for me. But once I understood the framework, they said you can get your characters from A to B any way you like. So they just have to, these are the things that have to happen. Anything other than that is entirely up to you. And so that was a really, really interesting experience. And, they allowed me to, I wouldn't say push the boundaries, but, they were kind of like, yeah, okay, we'll let that one go. We'll let that happen, sort of thing. And it has to date been my only editorial feedback where they've come back and said, could you add in some more skulls? Which was, I was like, yes, well, I can do entire piles of skulls if that's what you want. And that's what they wanted. So yeah, it was super interesting.
Sorry. I would imagine it feels like some sort of writing exercise. The whole, like, can I meet from point A, from point B, and all of that, the filling in, which was also what made me curious. I first thought about this whole process when with the Assassin's Creed novels, because I knew about the games and I was playing them, and after my brother, and then I saw that books were coming out, novelizations, and I always wondered how that was like, and because there are scenes from the games inside the books, and then all of the surrounding part, and I always wondered. So I had to have this question for you guys. And who wants to go next?
I can add to that a little bit from what I did in the magic fiction. Was always very interesting, because the fiction gets started quite late in the process of doing a new set. The process of doing a new set is this huge endeavor, because this isn't just a book that they're going to print 5,000 or 10,000 copies. These millions and millions of cards are going to be distributed all over the world. And so, whereas the fiction at the time was just going out on the web, and so they'd bring me in kind of late in the process, and they'd say, okay, well, we were thinking about having this as the story and this is the story, but it's not like set in stone. You've got these characters you should use. We don't. There's some sort of basic rules, but like nothing too specific. But then they'd be like, okay, but character A and character B have to have a meeting on a bridge where character A gives character B a sword, because some artist has been drawing that for the past 3 months, right? It's all visual. So they have not like plot beats, they have images from the set that you have to contextualize in the story. And I thought that was very funny. It's a very writing exercise way to approach things. Like, which of the two is the good guy and which is the bad guy we don't know. But like, they definitely have to have this sword meeting. So that was pretty great. The D&D book was actually, I had a ton of freedom with that. They were just like, do Spelljammer, go. The only thing they were really emphatic about was that it had to be in the D&D world. People had to have recognizable classes, and all the spells had to be spells from the D&D book, which is easy for me because I played D&D for a million years. And although I did have to, because I haven't played D&D in probably 10 years now or 15 years, so I had to go and like carefully read through all the 5th edition stuff because I wasn't like up on it yet. But that was, I had basically total freedom as far as it came to like the story and stuff, but it all had to fit the world design. So that's been my IP experience. And in terms of how it came to me, it's always come through my agent. Usually like I have my contracts for original stuff, and then if I have extra time, I ask my agent like, what else can I do to make some more money? And that tends to be when he goes and looks for things and says, well, why don't you do this IP work?
Yeah, we'll be touching on agents later and the importance of finding a good one, so good teaser. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can speak to mine. So mine actually came about kind of by accident. So I did it very much not the usual way. I went to a book event around the corner from my work that a friend of mine was going to, and the editor of Wildfire Books was at that event, and we just started chatting. And at the end, I like half-heartedly joked, oh, let me know if you need any near future thrillers. And then he was like, oh, we're doing IP. Do you want to write one set in space? And I said, sure, and decided I could do that. So I did have to like apply for it, write a sample. They kind of made me sign an NDA and everything. And I'd never even kind of knew that this was a thing that happened, that sometimes publishers will kind of in-house come up with a concept that they think is marketable and then find someone who they think fits well to write it. And it came actually at a really good time. And it was kind of the lifeline to my career because things had sort of fallen apart on me for the second time. And I was feeling really low, and I wasn't sure like if I was even going to keep writing. So I'm really grateful that I decided to go to that book event that day, and it happened to work out, and I decided to give it a go, even though it was very outside of my comfort zone. And I really enjoyed the experience. It went really smoothly. It felt very collaborative. They told me like, be more literary, make space sound really beautiful. And it was really great. So I'm so glad that I did it. Like the kind of downside is the advances tend to be lower. And so there's no guarantees if you'll get money off the back end. I was lucky enough that I did get enough like foreign rights and decent sales that it kind of added up to kind of be an average advance, I think. Unfortunately, releasing a book about 5 women trapped in extended quarantine in space that also had a pandemic releasing on Earth that bypassed children coming out in April 2020 was not ideal. But we made it work. And I'm still really fond of that book. I could never write it now. I had Roe versus Wade overturned in 2028 in that book, which was too optimistic in retrospect. And I am doing another one with them now. That's the one that I went to JSC for. So that one's all based on the moon. But that one's proving a little bit harder. Like I need them to help me a bit more with the plot. So that's what we're going to do next. But yeah, it was a great experience. It's nice. It's a nice different vibe. So if it's something you are kind of interested in, and you have like, if you're agented and maybe, you've gone on sub and you haven't sold an original book yet, this is another avenue you can try that can be a really fruitful way into the marketplace, and maybe a little bit less scary. And yeah, just a different way to do it. And I really enjoyed it.
I've heard from several people that the problem with near future thrillers, especially these days, is that reality keeps overtaking you.
Yeah, this one deals with AI and I'm trying to find a way to do it, which isn't going to get me immediately like either canceled or like the discourse is just going to change so much. So that's why I'm stuck on it. Like I've got most of the plot, but like the thematic argument is where I'm stuck.
I can only imagine. In that case, especially whenever you're doing anything that's contemporary related in any single way, you're always playing some sort of catch up in the end. But if, like you said, it's a way to get your feet wet for if you want to try writing in a more guided way, I suppose. And if it's an opportunity that you can have, as you said, it would be like, if you have the chance, take it, because it could be really good for you, for your career, for your writing journey.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I really got a lot out of it, and it reignited my career. Like, even though it came out at the worst possible time to ever release a book, you know, it kind of re-jumped me after I felt like I was kind of stuck in a rut and wasn't sure if I was going to get another contract. So
I will say, if, you know, for any aspiring writer types out there, if you get an offer like that, definitely ask around about who you're working with and see if you can find anyone else who's worked for them, what it was like. Because I have friends, you know, all my IP work has been pretty great, but I have friends who have done IP work for different companies that has turned into like a horrible nightmare of extra demands, and they send you the book back with like red ink dripping off of it and unreasonable requests. And so, you know, like working with any project, you need to know who you're working with.
yeah, that's a good thing to flag as well. Yeah, I got really lucky that it was really great. Like, they gave me as much flexibility or as little as I wanted, you know, like it's a very smooth experience. But yeah, that's not the case for everyone all the time.
My first, sorry, go on. My first Marvel novel, I think it was my first one. They handed it in on time, and then my editor got in touch with me and said, so they'd like to move the production schedule up a little bit. So they're going to send it back, and they would like you to do a complete edit in 9 days. Is that possible? And I was like, it's Marvel. Am I even allowed to say no because of everything that was in the contract and the NDA and everything? So I did it. I don't think I've ever been so exhausted in my life. It was 9 incredibly difficult days. And I did sort of say to my editor, here it is. I will not do this again for the next book. And she said, 100% understood. And to be honest, they were really, really fair with me for the second book. So yeah, but I think they do. I think there is, especially somebody like Marvel, there is, you know, there's a lot of stuff that I literally can't talk about because of the NDA and the strictures of the contract. But it is pretty much a case of, if you don't like it, we'll go get someone else, because we're Marvel and we can do what we like. And the thing is, there is an absolute kudos to have your name associated with that red and white logo. And that was one of the big draws for me, was because I wanted to sort of establish myself a little bit better in the US, and I thought that might be a good way of doing it. But you know, I mean, they are very much a case of, for my second book, I sent over, I think, about 8 or 9 pitches, and they would just send them back, rejected. Do you even understand the law? Rejected. And I was like, clearly I don't understand the ins and outs of the history of the comics well enough to get this past them. And you know, they can just say what they like and do what they like because of who they are. So yeah, it can be a bit fraught depending on who you're writing for. But you know, I'm super proud of both of those books, and I don't regret it. I don't ever want to do an edit in 9 days again. However.
Well, I will not mention IPs. I'll just say I'm 0 for 2, and I'll never do it again. I have one that anyway, I have tried twice because I had time in my writing schedule, and I wouldn't even try again. And in both cases, and I recognize the arrogance of what I'm about to say, but the issue came down to matters of lore, and I was like, I don't think you guys understand your own lore, and you should go back to the people who originally wrote it and ask them which one of us is right. And they wouldn't do that. And in each case, I'm like, okay, we're done. And you all know I write very fast. So, all right, that's 30,000 words I'll never see again. And I just put it away, and maybe I can cut a chunk out of it for another book some other time. But I find those restrictions, I guess this is what I'm saying, to be too restrictive. Anyway, I'll just leave it there. But I do want to put in a more interesting story very quickly, which it's not exactly IP, but I recently had an opportunity to write for television. And this may come to nothing, so I don't want, and it's weirdly not one of my books. I was sitting with some movie producers, and I told a historical story, that is to say, something that really happened. And they're like, oh my God, what a great story. Let's make a TV series. And so then started the process. And I write fiction. I've never been involved in writing episodic television. And it's still ongoing, and I'm not sure it'll come to anything and you'll ever see it on television. But I'm just going back to an earlier conversation. I find it very humbling because it's a completely different genre with all kinds of complex rules about how interaction has to work and how much you can fit into an episode. And anyway, very, very interesting and very humbling as usual.
And I'm very, very curious. But so we mentioned this, and we already said, and we talked about agents and the importance of them. And we all know, for whatever context, having the right agent will make or break you, essentially. And talk to us a little bit about what it is like to have a conversation with an agent to be like, okay, I want to publish in more than one genre. Or I wouldn't expect you to look for different agents, but do you start that process of looking for one by being like, okay, are you able to sell a different idea or a different genre? And how does that work with your own agents? And if you have a different idea, would you go up to them and say, okay, can you sell this? Or what do I need to do to sell this? So whichever way you want to go. And Quen, you can start.
When Miss Percy started to sell a little bit, I started to get interest from agents. I had several agents contact me, and I would have chats with them. And several of them just seemed very kind of fantasy centric. And when I got a contract offer from a publisher, I then realized, well, I really need an agent now. So I have to kind of buckle down and find someone so that I don't sign something I shouldn't or anything like that. So it was through the grapevine that I heard about my agent. She works with fantasy, she works with self-publishing, she works with romance. And so when I heard all of those points, I was like, oh, ding, ding, ding. So I contacted her, said I have a contract in hand. Are you interested in having a chat? And she immediately contacted, read my book, and we had a chat. And she pointed out very clearly that she works in different genres. She represents romance. She represents fantasy. She represents romantasy. She represents, I think, cozy mystery, different things like that. And that was very attractive to me, someone who could juggle, someone who just represented indie authors, but then would seek out foreign rights for them in other countries. And that to me was very important. And I had to go through several agents to find that, but it was worth the work, I think. So even now, when talking about my next project, we can talk about which publisher are we going to maybe contact with this? Are we going to keep it indie? She seems to have a good amount of knowledge about where we should go with the different subgenres. And so I would definitely suggest, if you're looking for an agent, to make sure you have a talk with them, make sure that you're on the same page for what you're writing. And if you are writing in different genres, if you can find someone who works in multiple genres, that's fantastic. And hopefully not just grab an agent because, oh, I have an agent now, and just kind of leap into that.
I can go next, maybe. I got lucky in that my agent is Juliet Mushins, who represents most things. But I kind of, just cold queried her, didn't really know what I wanted to be writing long term. I was really young at the time. I got signed when I was, I think, 22, so I was a little baby and knew nothing Jon Snow. But I just got lucky. I started in YA. She already represented both YA and adult. So when I did move to adult, it was fine. When I switched from fantasy to science fiction, it was fine. When I switched back, still fine. If I ever want to sell nonfiction, she's done that before. I do have one book idea that's not remotely SFF and should be able to sell that too. So I just got really lucky. But I'm not going to pretend it was intentional. I just lucked into it.
Yeah,
Luck is also a fair component.
I have a similar story. I was writing adult fantasy at the time. That was kind of all I wanted to write. And I queried agents on that basis. My agent, Seth Fishman, is wonderful. And it just happens that he represents a ton of different things. So we've done YA, we've done middle grade, we've done all these other pieces. Sometimes he's the one who asks me if I want to do stuff. If he sees something being successful, he says, hey, have you ever thought about doing this? And that's resulted in a few projects. But it's definitely, nice to have an agent who works in many genres, at least of all the kinds that I like to write. But that was also just luck. I didn't plan that.
My agent, he only represents speculative fiction and high concept thrillers. So he is a little bit more restricted than everyone else is. But he's also been really, really open about if you decided to go just completely off piste and write something that I cannot sell, then he's always said that his first port of call will be someone else within the agency to sort of try and keep me and my work in-house as much as possible. And the rest of the agency, they do cover a really broad selection, everything from crime to thriller to romance to children's fiction to self-help. So they've got a very, very broad range between the agents at the agency. So I wouldn't feel, I wouldn't feel in any way hesitant about speaking to him first. We've got a really good working relationship. I remember when I was sort of starting to think about my second trilogy, and I sort of threw the word sci-fi out there, and he just said, you absolutely can if you want, but if you want to sort of try and establish yourself first, maybe do a couple of trilogies within fantasy, and then we can look at expanding afterwards. Which for me at the time, I thought was great advice. I still think it's great advice because it did give me a really good grounding in writing fantasy and how to write fantasy. And I think if I hadn't have had that, I would have been a lot more hesitant about moving into IP work, just because of those similarities, especially in Age of Sigmar and stuff like that. But the book that's out on submission at the moment is still fantasy, but it is very, very different. It's not epic fantasy. It's not, cataclysmic wars. It's not, huge religious battles and stuff like that. And he's just been really supportive of me all the way through. So yeah, I think if you've got an agent that works for a decent sized agency, even if that agent doesn't represent the new thing that you want to write, there's a very good chance that you can still stay in-house, which I think just benefits everyone and keeps that working relationship alive.
I'd also imagine contract-wise, they would be like fairly in the same ballpark and stuff. And Christian?
Pass.
Yeah.
Seriously, I'm from another generation, and I think that my agent experience has nothing to do with the current world. I would say that, yeah, I should pass.
But now is your chance.
I think I commend you, because I think more people should do that, because people ask me about, I've got my agent, what, like 10, 12 years now, and it already feels like a world that no longer exists. So going back even farther, it's like, you know, it's not as applicable. I've had too many authors who, you know, of the, like, you know, who are older than you say, "Oh, this is the only way to start a career."
I love my agent, and she has done absolutely sterling work. She does every genre in the world, but she's also 84 years old, and she knows everyone in publishing. She knows every editor. She knows most of the publishers. She knows most of the executive staff. And that's how the world used to work. And I don't give her a book and tell her to sell it. If I have an idea that's outside of my standard genres, I usually go to the editor of that genre, ask them if they want to read it. And then when I sell it, I go back to Shelley and go like, okay, do your worst. I've done my bit. Because I've also been in the business so long that I know who to talk to. So it's not that I go to my agent and say, oh, hat in hand, I have a science fiction novel. Would you sell it for me? That, amongst other things, and I'm not sure this applies or works. That's why I was going to pass. I feel I'm better at selling my work to editors than anybody else is likely to be. So I'm more interested in making a direct contact and making a direct discussion than passing it secondhand through somebody who's going to try and describe what I've described to them, which always drives me nuts.
Yeah, I suppose there's something to be said about the broken telephone vibe of that. But if you have a good understanding, I imagine, with your agent, and you have found the person that is able to really bring what's in your mind out into words and use maybe the keywords that elude you, but somebody that wants to buy the book is going to pick up on. So we are starting to run out of time, so we are going to start closing out. But is there any other advice that you would like to give people who wish to try and publish in more than one genre? And we can start again from Quen, and just whatever you think, something that maybe you would have wanted to know before you started branching out, or anything else.
I think the advice that I would have given to myself when I first started self-publishing, goodness, too many years ago, more than a decade ago, would be don't stress about trying to keep things separate so much, because I did have that thought of, you know, my first book was a young adult contemporary. My second book then was, you know, the Victorian murder mystery. And I think I got so knotted up with worrying about how am I going to market this book to different audiences that I ended up poorly marketing both of them, because I was so worried that I'll offend these people by, see, I'm not writing another contemporary young adult, so now I'll just clam up and not say anything about this because they're expecting this other thing from me. And I really feel that with us all having to put ourselves out there so much and market ourselves, that you just have to put yourselves out. I mean, publishers will go and market different books that they're putting out. We're putting out a sci-fi, we're putting out a romantasy. And I think we have to do so much of the publishing work ourselves. We just have to talk like publishers. Well, now this book that I'm putting out is a Victorian. Now this book that I'm putting out is, you know, contemporary. And we just kind of have to go with that feeling and find what readers we can.
My only advice would be take your shot. I think more people I've talked to are too nervous about it. Will my readers be offended, or, you know, will this work? And, you know, I'm not saying it'll always work, but I'd say you probably end up with more. It'll work. What am I trying to say? From the people I've talked to, more people have been happy they took the shot than regretted it, because, you know, in the worst case, you lose some time, you lose some effort, and you try again. So, you know, if it's a thing that you want to do and you're kind of like, oh, should I do it?
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think there's so much to be learned from the experience just of writing in a different genre that whether it takes off the way you want it to or not is kind of a secondary consideration, at least with like the first time you swap genres and you write something totally different, because it's you getting to play in a different sandbox and you getting to learn a bunch of different rules and you getting to stretch different writing muscles and discover whether you have a talent for writing this different genre. So yeah, you know, maybe the first one isn't as good as it could be, or maybe it's great because you find out actually I am really good at this. But I think with, you know, however it turns out, definitely more people are pleased they did it than didn't. And when it comes to finding readers, I think it goes for any genre, whether it's your typical one or a new one. But I think author enthusiasm, genuine enthusiasm, always sells a lot, because, you know, if you're one of these polished, manufactured personalities on social media, that's you know, I mean, okay, some people like looking at that, but if you're like a messy, chaotic, feral goblin who has just climbed out of your writing cave to go, oh my god, I finished a book, people tend to relate to that a lot better. So yeah, I think enthusiasm for whatever you're writing is always of paramount importance.
Anna, I'm going to guess which one of those you see yourself as. I'm just going to agree with everyone else. Write what you love. I've heard that said once or twice. I don't think I made that up myself. But absolutely, if it's the thing you want to do, do it. There's readerships for all of these things. I do remember, and again, I'm dating myself, when I had an editor go like, no, you can't. You write thrillers. You can't go off and write historical fiction. That was like 2002. And even then, I thought that was daft. But I don't think any editor would say that now. I think crossing genres is now almost banal, where once upon a time it was very daring. And somebody in comments said, if nobody hates what you've written, nobody's going to love what you've written. Or if you write a book nobody hates, you've written a book that nobody will love. I will translate that to say, yeah, a couple of your fans will probably say, oh my God, you chose to write spicy romance? That I wanted more armor. And my answer to that would be, if I feel like writing spicy romance, which is not on my list, although it could happen, because I love romance. No, sorry, I wanted to say this way back. I actually have always read romance going back to, I don't know, high school. And again, Georgette Heyer was an expert historical fiction writer. She knew more about the Regency than most people. Anyway, romance. There's a lot of really good stuff out there. But all I'm trying to say is, if that's what you feel like writing, write it, like everyone else said.
Yeah, my backlist is very eclectic if you look at it. And sometimes I second guessed myself and I was like, oh, you know, what would my career have looked like if I'd stayed in fantasy consistently instead of kind of flip-flopping back and forth? Because I probably lost some people along the way but gained others. But I do think because I've jumped around and really written what I loved and what really excited me or challenged me at the time, it means that like I may have like a core readership that's a little bit smaller because I have jumped around rather than establishing a clear brand. But it means that they are kind of like my ride or die folks. Like they will read whatever I put out, even if it's really oddball. And I think there is still a consistency to like the themes that I keep picking up and the way that I write, you know, my style and stuff, even if I'm always trying to do weird experimental craft things as well sometimes. So yeah, like I think you can only do what you can do. And I'd rather be someone who tries something different and stretches myself in new ways than kind of like writing the same book with minor differences over and over again. Like that can, I'm sure, be really lucrative. And if you really enjoy that, that's all grand. But I think I would get bored. And I think for me, if I did that, I think the readers would be able to tell my heart wasn't in it anymore. So I will just keep writing whatever weird thing strikes my fancy and hope people come along.
Well, it's definitely true. If we find an author that we love, we say that as a joke, but a lot of us will say, I will read a phone book if you write one. Because we enjoy the way the author writes and the way they see the world, and the way they present the world and everything. So
yeah, like I'd say like write whatever does really make you excited, and like the readers are out there, they will match your freak.
Eleni, can I just answer something that Griftkin just said in the comments section? When somebody like Butcher writes the Dresden Files, I'm not sure that publisher pushback is because the publisher doesn't think they can't write other things. I think the publisher pushback is because they're always looking for the highest profit ratio. And they're like, oh no, as long as we can keep generating 80,000 sales out of this, we don't want you to write anything else. That's not the same thing. And maybe it's the highest recommendation for being a squarely mid-list author. Nobody cares when I change genre because I'm not going to sell 80,000 copies, so nobody has to worry about that.
I mean, I 100% agree with that, but also Jim Butcher has written other things. He did the Furies of Calderon. He tried the Aeronauts Windless. He's done several other types of books.
It's a little bit like, oh, Jurassic Park was a really great film. Quick, let's make 5 others of increasingly poor quality. But we know that I'm not saying any people who write long series are increasingly poor quality, but in the case of films, you find that it very often is, because they just know that they're going to get people in. They're still going to get the footfall. They're still going to get the cinema tickets. So, it's the same sort of industry, isn't it? People, they're like, we will flog it until it's dead, and then we will flog it a little bit more just to get every last penny out of it, kind of thing.
That also heavily depends on genre. I feel some will apply themselves well to this, and even if the fans are like, yeah, it's getting tired, but I will go see the next big dinosaur on screen or whatever. But others don't work as well. But anyway, yeah, the cash cows, as somebody is also saying in the comments. Anywho, thank you, everybody. I think we have run out of time, sort of. Yes. Teeny tiny bit more. I'm very proud of all of you. We kept on track very well.
Sorry again for being late. I did have a 2-minute panic attack where I was like, do I come in late or do I not? So yes. I am glad I showed up halfway through.
I am glad as well. I was missing you. Oh no. But it's excellent. We still made it through halfway and we had more than enough to say. So thank you to everybody who joined us. And there are still a couple panels today. Very, very interesting. And this week is still going strong, so make sure to tune in till Sunday. And goodbye, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us. This has been great.
Oh, wait. I'm an idiot. You need to tell me. You need to tell everybody when they can find you and what you have next. But make it condensed.
I was going to do that guerrilla style. At Django Wexler on Blue Sky is where I hang out on social media these days, or DjangoWexler.com. My next upcoming book is a sequel to How to Become the Dark Lord and Die Trying, which is called Everybody Wants to Rule the World Except Me. And that'll be out in May.
I guess I'll go next. My next book is called The Venetian Heretic. It's based on a true story of how the Pope tried to get an opera banned in 17th century Venice and used assassins to try and kill off the librettocists. It's a departure, but there is still sword fighting. It's literally a 17th century historical mystery novel about opera. Not my normal day-to-day, and that's why Spicy could be next, for all I know. You can find me on Blue Sky. I think I'm Fokion on Blue Sky. Honestly, I am terrible about these things. I think it's because I'm old. I still have a lingering Twitter presence, but I never go there, and I probably never will again. And and I have a web page, which is worth visiting. Here's my big push, because I have a bunch of free stuff there. So you can decide whether you actually like my stuff without spending a dime. And I have a very recent Christmas story set in my Sci-Fi universe, which would be useful to read if you plan to read the rest of the series. That's my push. Christian Cameron author? Yeah, that's right.
Thanks.
That reminds me. Yes, if you go to my website and sign up for my newsletter, I will send you a free novella. So come and do it. It's great. It's about dragons. Well, no, it's about killing a dragon and then trying to get all the gold home afterwards.
Yep, I've got a newsletter as well at lrlam.co.uk, and you get a free rom-com because I self-published some like FF romance novellas set in the publishing industry just for fun one time. So they're there, and they're also on Kindle Unlimited. My latest series is Dragonfall. There we go. That came out in 2023, and the sequel's out in March. Look, I just got it. This is the Barnes & Noble edition, which has fancy stuff.
She's so
I'm
pretty.
very excited. So yeah, Emberclaw's out in early March. Dragonfall's out now. I've got some other stuff too across whatever subgenre you so desire. I am on social media, but it's also all on fire. So follow whichever ones I'm on, but please sign up for the newsletter. Thank you.
So I'll go next. You can find me on social media. I'm here and there, Blue Sky and Threads and all of those. Honestly, if you just Google my name, since it's unusual enough, it's easier to find me because then everything pops up where I am, my website. So just Quenby Olson, Google it, and it's all there. I just finished publishing the last book of the Miss Percy series, which is now also out on audio and also in French. The next project that I have, which I am about to finish, I think I'm about a chapter from the end, is the working title is The Womanly Art of Monster Hunting, which is basically trying to sell it in a sentence is Cranford with dead bodies and vampires. So a little bit of kind of cozy horror, I guess, is what we're going for now. And that's it. I'm going to slink away, and then I think it's Anna's turn.
Okay, so all of I'm on a fair few of the social medias, Blue Sky and Instagram. You can find me at anna-stevens.com, Stevens with a PH. I've got a novel that's out on submission at the moment, which, as I said earlier, is a departure from my current stuff. It is a fantasy heist novel, which I had a ridiculous amount of fun writing. So if there's any editors watching, please buy it because I really want to write the sequel. I've also just finished the first draft of another fantasy book, which is, again, a totally different departure, and it heavily features dragons, which is my first ever sort of traditional fantasy creature novel. So that's going to go through a sort of second draft, and then it's off to my agent to see what he thinks of it. And yeah, that's me.
Question is, which animal are your dragons inspired by?
Well, I have a poodle, so I'm going to say that they're inspired by poodles, which is chaotic.
Eleni, I think you have another panel there.
Oh, yes. I'm taking notes for next year. This organizer is very tired this year, but I'm taking notes for next one.
We can have the argument between four-legged dragons and six-legged dragons, or six-limbed dragons.
Okay. I'm going to let everyone go, so I'm ending the stream now. And